With the recent rumors and tease about a possible Final Fantasy IX remake, it's reassuring to know that Square Enix has been excellent at remaking their classic RPG series in the past few years. But it hasn't always been the case. In fact, one of the first main modern remakes Square Enix tried to pull off went totally wrong. Today, I want to talk about a game that's pretty close to my heart and that Square Enix managed to completely mess up in its remake, Secret of Mana. Released in 1993 on the Super Nintendo, the original Secret of Mana introduced an entire generation outside of Japan to Squaresoft's incredible storytelling, music, and gameplay. So when I first heard about a 3D remake for this game, I was extremely hopeful. Remakes were not as common as nowadays, and Square Enix had a very limited but convincing track record for these types of games, with their 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV back in 2008. The problem is, this time, they made pretty much all the wrong artistic decisions, despite being very open to the project to begin with, despite waiting years to formulate a perspective and now a review that tried to be as objective as possible. To this day, I still simply cannot find any redeeming quality in this remake. In fact, I'd like this video to be a good reminder to Square Enix and all the developers capitalizing so much on video game remakes. This is what you should not do when remaking a game. First, let's talk about the story and the writing. For those of you unfamiliar with the original game, Secret of Mana tells a fairly simple story which takes place in a world where mana, life's energy, has in the past caused mankind's technological rise, which provoked the wrath of the gods and led to the near extinction of civilization. The game starts many years later as the world is rebuilding when an orphan boy named Randy stumbles on the Sword of Mana. Pulling out the weapon from its resting place, he unleashes forces and a destiny he could never have imagined. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. The remake does not change the story in any significant way. There are a few minor additions like little character skits after staying at inns, a new voice acting which is neither great nor horrible, and there is some minor rewriting. And that's not necessarily a problem. We don't always need a complete retelling like Final Fantasy VII Remake, right? Especially with Secret of Mana and its fairly simple story to begin with. My problem with this remake is that the little rewriting that was done actually manages to make things too obvious or too explicit or just badly written. One example, the opening scene.
But as time passes, so history repeats.
Maybe it's the poet in me, but why change the river metaphor here? Were they afraid the audience would not get it? You could think I'm nitpicking here, but here's another example where the rewriting, while trying to cater to a modern audience, ends up making the lore less coherent. I'm getting a little bit into spoilers here. It's a pretty big plot twist about our hero, so here's a warning and you can skip for about 2 minutes if you want. Okay, ready? So, one plot element we learn midway through the game is that our hero is actually the son of members of the Mana tribe, a tribe in charge of protecting the Mana tree and its energy. And here's how the dialogue was rewritten. In the original game, it is said, "That was your father, Seren, I was his wife, and I am your mother. We are of the Mana tribe. The women of our kind become the tree and the protectors of the world. The men wield the sword and protect against evil." And the remake's rewriting says, "Yes, it is true, your father was the legendary knight and I was his wife, your mother. We are of the Mana tribe. Members of our tribe are fated to become the Mana tree to protect the world for future generations. Others, like your father, inherit the Mana sword to fight the evils that threaten peace and prosperity." So, okay, I get the whole let's move away from gender stereotypes with the nurturing mother and the protective father thing, okay, fair enough. But this new explanation makes no sense. Why was the father in charge of holding the sword, among others in the tribe? What made him special? And the syntax doesn't make sense here. If the father is one of the others compared to whom? Members of our tribe, mentioned just before? It just doesn't make any sense. Anyway, this is just one aspect, maybe minor, but again, to be fair, the plot and the writing and so on were not necessarily the most important qualities of the original game. But those problems foreshadow every single issue I have with this remake. The gameplay and artistic directions were really the most memorable things with the original Secret of Mana, so how did Square Enix manage to mess them up? First, let's talk about the gameplay, and it's simply a missed opportunity here. Nothing is worse than the original, but nothing much was improved either, and many things that should have obviously been improved were completely ignored. The original Secret of Mana was a fairly conventional action RPG in terms of gameplay and exploration. Our 2D sprites would progress screen by screen through different areas of reasonable size. No navigation map was available in each area except when flying on the world map later in the game. In each area, we controlled a character of our choice, the AI taking care, more or less, of the other two characters. Actions were limited: directional buttons, A button to sprint in a straight line, B button to attack enemies, and Y and X to open the ring menu of respectively our main character and their teammates. These ring menus, unique to the Seiken Densetsu franchise, gave access to equipment, stats, magic, inventory, general settings, and a few strategies for the AI. Despite these options, AI was one of the main limitations of the original game. Secondary characters would often get stuck behind obstacles which would freeze the frame and prevent us from moving our main character where we wanted to. Combats in the original game were also imperfect at times. The attack button allows your controllable character to hit the enemy with your equipped weapon, but only at certain intervals. There's a gauge that you need to fill at 100%, taking roughly a second or two for your blow to be at full power. By using the same weapon often and upgrading it at the Dwarven Blacksmith, you could unlock special attacks triggered by holding the attack button. Finally, items and magic could only be triggered by selecting them in the ring menu, and doing so, pausing the game. Those mechanisms put together led to a weird pace during combats, especially during bosses, where the main strategy was essentially to spam magic and constantly pausing the game. But fortunately, and that's where the original game was really amazing for a JRPG at the time, a local multiplayer option was there, playing late into the night with my best friends, hacking rabbits and werewolves, grinding our characters and our magic abilities. This is one of my best video game memories ever, and that's why I'm really annoyed at how this remake managed to miss the mark here. But I'll get to that later. First, in terms of gameplay, what struck me the most from the first couple of minutes of the game is how, except for the introductory cutscenes, the remake is frame by frame the same as the original. Areas, layout, dialogue, narrative sequence, puzzles, everything is literally the same except in 3D. So from the beginning I felt this remake was a little bit lazy, for a lack of better words, and it became clearer the more I played. The AI hasn't necessarily been improved much, and your secondary characters still get stuck on regular occasions, but the freezing of the frame has been removed, allowing your controllable character to continue their progression, even if it means abandoning behind one of your teammates, so this solution is barely optimized. One noteworthy UI addition is a navigation map that can be toggled on. It can be helpful, but it also shows how this remake project was minimalistic in its approach. The map simply shows the Super Nintendo tiles of each area. When I first noticed this, nostalgia kicked in, and then, as minutes of gameplay went by, it simply reminded me again and again that I might be better off just playing the original game instead. Same for combats, it's a complete missed opportunity here. The 100% gauge is still there, as if no lessons were learned from the game's sequel, Seiken Densetsu 3, or Trials of Mana, which had abandoned that feature and had an otherwise much smoother combat experience. The ring menu hasn't been changed either, except for a couple of new sub-menus such as a journal. I was hoping the remake would provide a better flow, but you can now only create a couple of shortcuts with the L and R buttons, and the game still pauses if the selected ability requires you to select a specific enemy. So the problem with constantly pausing combats, especially bosses, is still there. Worse, the LR shortcuts feature is disabled altogether when in multiplayer. And this leads me to my last point gameplay-wise. Multiplayer is still available, but only offline. And I don't get it. Apparently, the developers argue that this choice was made to stay true to the original game. But like many other things, it seems more like an excuse for a rushed or under-budgeted remake project. Younger gamers' habits have changed, and players my age have simply fewer opportunities to launch a 2-hour gaming session at home with my buddies after work. In fact, I have kids, I've moved cities, I play late when everyone is in bed. It was so frustrating for me to not even be able to play online with my childhood friends I'm still in touch with, and to at least try to emulate something close to what we experienced together 30 years ago. So, no online multiplayer and the overall lack of gameplay improvements in this remake were extremely disappointing for me. But even the things Square Enix tried to modernize actively in this remake were counterproductive, and this leads me to art direction. This was one of the main strengths of the original game. The graphics themselves were impressive, with beautifully animated sprites and colorful environments that to this day still hold up very well. Of course, later action RPGs such as Trials of Mana or Tales of Phantasia pushed the Super Nintendo even further in terms of performance, but Secret of Mana's unique style and identity can simply not be forgotten. What characterized the entire art direction of the original game was probably how impactful, colorful, and often surprising it felt throughout. Anyone who has played the original game will remember a certain puzzle in a forest involving the passage of the 4 seasons, and the distinct gameplay and visual experience it gave us, or the unsettling techno beat music accompanying a boss fight. In other words, the original game's ability to set and change moods very quickly was Secret of Mana's biggest artistic strength, in my opinion. Unfortunately, this has been lost in translation in the remake, and we can see that from seconds into the game. The title screen is left pretty much untouched, and that was a smart choice. The tempo is very similar, allowing a slow build-up to the beautiful music and original illustration introducing us to the melancholic beauty of the Tree of Mana. But the opening cutscene takes, however, a very different stylistic approach that is not as effective. In the original game, the Mana Fortress was presented as a force of nature. No single frame would show the entire structure, but only parts of it. We could only imagine, seeing how many cannons were noticeable on a single frame, the sheer power this weapon could have. This transition into a second shot of the desolated landscape, and in the middle of it the beautiful, imposing Mana Tree, conveyed beautifully the coexisting feelings of dread and hope built by the game. The two scenes put back to back contrast visually. The extremely industrial, brown, and dense visuals of the fortress are nothing like the open, bare, natural landscape of the Mana Tree. Then, before we start our adventure as Randy, a traveling shot goes over the world map in Mode 7 technology, a technological feat at the time for the Super Nintendo. So this intro in the original game was extremely effective, visually and artistically speaking. In the remake, the opening sequence is very different in style, putting together still artworks into a sort of collage that, while very beautiful, very nice, feels too uniform, too clean, too sophisticated, more than the original use of 2D sprites and their very contrasting colors. Second, the remake's collage style allows to include many elements, objects, and plot points, which leads to a whole imagery that is, again, too explicit. We see the fortress in its entirety, the beast it fights against, the blast leading to the end of the world, and so on. So just like the writing I talked about earlier, Secret of Mana Remake's art direction is once again very straightforward and perhaps too direct, too explicit. We try to make things clearer to the audience, but to some extent at the cost of the more indirect and subtle moods the original game provided so subtly and beautifully. This is also felt in the broader transition of Secret of Mana from a 2D game to a 3D remake. While the visual layout during the playable portions of the game sticks very closely to the original game, the overall transition to 3D sprites make things less marked in terms of colors, saturation, contrasts, and overall impact. It just feels less beautiful and memorable. The same can be said about the game's music. I must acknowledge how the rearrangements have tried to move away enough from the original game while keeping each track very recognizable, and that's a really good effort. But it wasn't always effective. The use of modern samples and instruments instead of good old MIDI sounds logically made the soundtrack more smooth and polished, which was less surprising than what we would feel when hearing for the first time some of the very unconventional and aggressive tracks used for some bosses and locations in the original game. And this is on top of some tracks being simply spoiled due to weird additions or sonorities or rhythms, which made already complex compositions too complex for their own sake. So while I'm all for supporting any project bringing more players to Secret of Mana, and the Mana series in general, this remake is too minimalistic and short-sighted to bring any added value to the original. Now, perhaps I've been a bit too tough on Square Enix. I don't know the details behind the development of this game, but I really suspect minimal investment was made here. And as much as I'd like to see a proper re-release of that game up to better standards, I cannot help but think that all the mistakes made for this remake served as lessons to Square Enix. Not only for its sequel, Trials of Mana Remake, which is excellent and should be the subject of another video soon, but also more generally for Square Enix's entire wave in recent years of some of the most memorable and respectful JRPG remakes ever created. As I discussed in another video, just last year they released 3 absolute bombs, not only with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Dragon Quest III, but also Romancing Saga 2 Remake, which is really a hidden gem. Check out this retrospective if you haven't already, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, let me know in the comments and subscribe.